So you do have those peace process influences, you do have new perspectives, you do have a changed political climate and environment, you do have ongoing research, which is also coming to the fore during that period. In 2003, for example, the Bureau of Military History statements that I mentioned earlier were finally released. These were the statements from the veterans collected on behalf of the state that had been locked up in government buildings in 83 steel boxes in 1959. There was no agreement as to when they might be released. There had been an advisory group of historians appointed who were frustrated with the idea that it would be locked up for so long. Another member of that advisory group was Richard Hayes, who was the Irish film censor. He suggested that if they were released, particularly in the 1960s, that the result would be local civil warfare in every village and parish in the country. The idea that these would not be seen as historical statements, they would be seen as current affairs. And a cautious and conservative approach was taken in relation to not wanting to reopen old wounds. Perhaps that was wise. When we reflect, for example, on the recent Boston College debacle, we can see the danger of current affairs running into history in relation to locking up oral testimony. But you also have all sorts of difficulties around the use of oral history in relation to this commemorative analysis. The idea of oral history being in the parish of truth as opposed to representing the truth. But you're going to get that issue with all sorts of different sources. Broadly speaking, these 800 witness statements did afford a lot of new perspectives and certainly the grassroots experiences of that era. Now, the peace process climate that I mentioned earlier on ultimately produced the Queen's visit in 2011, Queen Elizabeth II visiting the Republic for the first time. There was a lovely historical symmetry, it seemed, about this because the previous monarch to set foot in Southern Ireland had been her grandfather in 1911, exactly 100 years previously. And the hands of history were being felt everywhere to the extent that they were crushing shoulders. It was an extraordinary time and an extraordinary visit, partly, I would argue, because the programme was so audacious. What you had, in effect, were silent but very highly charged and quite emotive confrontations with a very difficult past. There was some far-fetched speculation that the Queen might apologise during the one occasion when she did speak at the banquet in Dublin Castle. And, of course, the diplomats had been working on a form of words feverishly in the months previously to try and come up with a way of expressing regret that wouldn't involve a formal apology. Though, of course, the Queen in the current climate is not in that business in a way that her grandfather was in relation to direct political intervention. His intervention, for example, in 1921 was very important in bringing about the talks that ultimately led to the Anglo-Irish Treaty. The defining image of that visit was the Queen with her head bowed in the Garden of Remembrance, a very, very powerful image, and said an awful lot. And it was about the culmination of the peace process. And President McAleese referred very directly to the visit being, in effect, the icing on the peace process cake in 2011. And some look back to the origins of these particular shared history initiatives, because, of course, the Queen visited not only Croke Park, the scene of the Bloody Sunday massacre, not only the Garden of Remembrance that honour those who fought against the British Empire, but also, of course, the Island Bridge War Memorial, which had been almost a derelict site by the 1980s, which had been done up in more recent years to reflect, again, the peace process music. There was a suggestion that the unveiling of the Irish Peace Tower at Messines in Belgium in 1998, when the Queen and Mary McAleese attended, had been the first official recognition of Irish soldiers' contribution to the First World War in the British Army. And here is where we get, again, these exaggerated, sweeping assertions that do not withstand significant scrutiny. If you consider, some of the attitudes of those from the 1920s onwards about the First World War and Irish involvement in the First World War. Kevin O'Higgins, for example, as a government minister in the 1920s, had represented the Irish government at the British War Cenotaph in Westminster. Kevin O'Higgins had two brothers who fought in the British Army during the First World War, and one of them was killed in France. But Kevin O'Higgins was also aware at that early stage that a proposal to have an Irish War Memorial in Merrion Square was not appropriate because it was so close to government buildings and would give out, in his own words, the wrong signal about the origins of this state. But you've got to distinguish also between official remembrance and private remembrance. Bernadette McCalliskey, for example, who emerged on the political scene in the late 1960s, extraordinarily dynamic and intelligent politician, talked about the memory of the war dead, the British Army dead, the Irish men in the British Army when she was growing up in a nationalist area. And she felt that this whole narrative of the forgotten World War I veterans was too contrived. We never forgot, she said. We didn't forget the fathers and the grandfathers. They were real people in real communities. She said her mother thought nothing about buying poppies whilst also buying Easter lilies in any given year. But there's no doubt the problem of state remembrance was there. There's no question, of course, that difficulty was there from the 1920s onwards. And that peace process music was also relevant, I suppose, to what had been the traditional rallying call of Irish Republicans in relation to our gallant allies in Europe. Who now were our gallant allies in Europe? Was it our firm friends in Britain? The firm friends being the phrase so often used around that time. Where did our gallant allies in Europe stand at that stage? And again, how was the Department of Foreign Affairs going to manage this new dispensation? One incident that I found quite bemusing around this time in 2011 was an invitation from the Department of Foreign Affairs to attend a day for community activists in Dublin Castle, community activists who were coming down from both sides of the divide in Northern Ireland. And I asked what this was about, because I asked a number of historians to speak, and we were told that it was about the decade of commemorations. So we said, fine, quite happy to speak about that. And when we arrived, our conference pack had a different title. The title on the pack was A Decade of Reconciliation. Now, there's a big difference between a decade of commemoration and a decade of reconciliation, and I had to make that point at the time. And this is not about being against reconciliation. Who's against reconciliation? But it was being about the interchangeable use of those terms, reconciliation and commemoration, which again was fitting into a different agenda. And there were interesting discussions that day about the inclusion of new communities, of the so-called non-nationals, of the idea of a need to commemorate people as opposed to commemorating events. But it was framed very much by the officials, not by the community workers, in the context of the peace process and the idea of reconciliation. And that reference I made to the gallant allies in Europe also took on a new resonance as a result of the economic crash, the extent and gravity of which became so apparent from 2007 and 2008 onwards. And again, this was relevant, I think, to commemorating that revolutionary period. Once again, we had the invoking of the ghosts of that period of Irish history. I was asked to give a lecture, for example, in 2010 under the title, Is De Valera Turning in His Grave? In the same way as you had that idea in 1966 of Pearse turning in his grave. You could have said at that stage in 2010 that the earth in Glasnevin Cemetery was so upturned that many of the bodies had actually flown the cemetery at that time, given the extent of what was happening.